Hi there. I'd like to tell you about the first day of school in two classrooms at the middle school just down the street. We're going to take a look inside the classroom of Mrs. Smith and Mr. Johnson. Mrs. Smith is one of everyone's favorite teachers at this middle school. She's a fantastic teacher. She's been teaching for about 10 years. She's got a warm personality. Her classroom is warm and inviting. She works really hard at her job to build relationships with students, make them feel encouraged and safe, everything that a good teacher should do. She's well organized, and she loves her kids and she loves her subject. And so on the first day of school in Miss Smith's class, students walk in and they see a brightly colored classroom with very welcoming message up on the board. It's really, really well decorated. And already before the students even meet Miss Smith, they're excited for the school year. And then Miss Smith comes up to the front of the room. She passes out a textbook and a syllabus. And because Miss Smith is so excited about her job and about her subject, she immediately starts instilling an excitement about the subject area. It's science in her students. And her students really enjoy it. Now, she spends the first day going over the paper syllabus, talking about some of the great things, exciting experiments they're going to do this year, also going over some of the classroom policies and procedures, maybe some of the schedule, how to get in touch with her. And then they actually crack open the textbook and explore the textbook on the first day of school, which is a pretty common thing to do, and just become familiar with this great tool that they're going to take home, learn about how the chapters are organized and how the problems at the end of the chapters, what those will look like, and then that kind of leads into a discussion about homework and how they'll be assessed. And so she explains to them that every day they'll come in, there'll usually be a warm up on the board, maybe a learning objective also on the board. And then there'll be a brief lecture, then there'll be some activity, then some opportunity for independent practice. Then there'll usually be homework, usually out of the textbook, or maybe a worksheet or something that she sends home with the students. And then occasionally there'll be a quiz to check their understanding, and then an opportunity at the end of every unit to demonstrate mastery of that content, usually a test, maybe once toward the end of the year, a big project, maybe like a poster or a presentation or something like that. So, but like I said, Ms. Smith is just such an engaging and warm and affectionate person that her students leave her classroom at the end of first period really excited for the rest of the year. Then they go down the hall, the bell rings, and they go down the hall, and their second period teacher is Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson is let's say some kind of STEM teacher, engineering teacher, like something like that. And when they walk into Mr. Johnson's room, they notice it's a little bit different. First of all, when you walk into Mr. Johnson's room, it's not clear where the front of the room is. There's no whiteboard or chalkboard. There are a couple large monitors placed around the room, but nothing clearly indicating the front. When they actually walk in the room, Mr. Johnson is at the door greeting students by name as they walk in. He has an iPad with him and he's scrolling through their photos that he got off of the school database. And as the students walk in, he says, "Oh, hey, Jose, hey, Frank." And as the students walk in, he's greeting them by name, and maybe even he sees where they were last period. And on his iPad, he says, "Oh, how was Miss Smith's class?" And then the students walk in, and when they walk in, here's what's a little bit interesting. They notice, like I said, there's no front. They don't even see a teacher desk, which is pretty common, no podium or anything like that. But they do notice and the desks are arranged in pods of 4. And so the students start sitting down at picking desks. But when they sit down, they realize there's just a little slip of paper with a URL and their name on it. And they realize, oh, this isn't my desk. So Jose gets up and says, this was Frank's desk apparently, and they switch. Eventually they get to the right seats. And there's a little URL. Maybe the URL has an indicative or informative name. It's like Mr. Johnson's stemclass.com, or maybe it's one of those shortened URLs, tiny URL or something. And so they sit there, and then the bell rings, and Mr. Johnson just walks into the classroom. He doesn't introduce himself. He just starts kind of circulating and kind of seeing what students will do. One student eventually pulls his phone out and enters the URL into his phone, and it turns out it's Mr. Johnson's class website. And the first thing you see when you go to Mr. Johnson's class website on that day, it says Day 1 Challenge. And there's a challenge for the students that I'll explain in just a second. And so that first student says, huh. And some other student sees him do that. grabs his phone out of his pocket, starts going to the same website. A girl a couple tables over opens up her laptop, goes to the URL, and the students are reading, without any words or instruction from Mr. Johnson, are reading about the first day challenge. And here's the first day challenge. Mr. Johnson has challenged the students with finding, there's a brief little paragraph, maybe even a little short video for them to watch by Mr. Johnson. It's challenging them to find where the electricity enters the school building. There's a brief paragraph, not too much reading, that explains, like I said, maybe an accompanying video that explains, right now the lights are on, a couple of the monitors are on with maybe one of the monitors is a live feed actually from the space station. Another monitor has a live feed coming from some data at CERN. Pretty cool. But anyway, so the paragraph explains that these monitors are on, and the internet is working, and the lights are on. That electricity is coming from somewhere. We don't generate our own electricity here at the middle school. Where are we getting it? And so the paragraph ends by explaining that if they take their laptop or their phone, that will act as their hall pass, and they're actually given 15 minutes to go try to find where the power enters the building. And so the students, again, they haven't spoken to Mr. Johnson yet. They get up and they just kind of filter out. Mr. Johnson has alerted the administration ahead of time that there'll be small groups of middle schoolers walking around the building, maybe looking out the window, maybe even venturing out front if it's safe for them, which should be, it's school property, and taking a look. And it also says that they can either upload the photo to the class website or just text or email the photo. If they manage to take a photo, a lot of they can use the camera on their laptop. Oh, by the way, this is a school. It is the 21st century, so this is one of those schools that has chosen to invest in a one-to-one laptop initiative for all the students. These are middle schoolers. They've by this age they know how to take care of computers. So each student is given a Chromebook for the year. And even though this is the first day of school, Chromebook pickups were a couple days ago, and just about every student has managed to get their Chromebooks. So they're ready for the first day of school with this technology. And so their Chromebook has a camera on it. Most of them have smartphones that have cameras on them. So they go out and venture out and try to take a picture of where they think the electricity is entering the building. A couple groups of students end up doing a full lap around the school, and they do find a couple wires coming from a pole on the street entering the school. So most students kind of congregate around that, take a bunch of pictures, send it to Mr. Johnson. By the time the students arrive back in the building, and there's a time limit that is listed on the website, by the time the students come back to the classroom, most of the photos that they have sent in are already on those two displays. The displays that had the NASA and the CERN data are now being displayed, just kind of on a little loop or something. And once all the students are seated, Mr. Johnson asked them to explain what they saw and why they think that's a good picture. Turns out none of the students got it right, that the schools actually, the power actually comes from the power company, and it goes down underground under the faculty parking lot, and it goes underground into the building to a transformer, and that's where it actually gets stepped down, which is how a lot of big buildings do it. The picture that most of the students took was where power was actually leaving the building to go into the baseball field. But what happens there is students all got it wrong, and that's, first of all, an opportunity for Mr. Johnson to say, that's fine. I gave you a challenge. You are not experts in this yet, so welcome to my class where we're gonna fail and be challenged every day, and that's a completely safe place to do that. The grade you got on this activity was just if you gave it a shot, and then later they will talk more explicitly, more clearly about what the expectations for the class are and for obviously for various assignments. But that very naturally led into a conversation about how much electricity does the school use? Where does it get it? Does it get it all from the big power company in town? Does it generate any of its own power? Are there solar panels on the roof? A couple students say they think they've seen solar panels on the roof, which leads to a question about what were they doing on the roof, but that's for later. And then that actually leads into a conversation about sustainability, and where students can ask a lot of questions of Mr. Johnson about how the school gets power. And then Mr. Johnson even encouraged them to think about maybe any other ways of power generation that they've heard of, or even how the school maybe is wasting power. And this is all first period of the first day. Maybe they get into a conversation about maybe the ways that the school could do a better job at conservation. By the end of the day, Mr. Johnson indicates that the syllabus is on the class website, and they're expected to just skim through it for homework because they'll be talking about more class policies and procedures the next day. By the time the students leave the classroom, they're really engaged, not as much because Mr. Johnson came across as this sage on the stage or this fount of knowledge that they'll be learning from, but already on that first day, Mr. Johnson has built an atmosphere of self-discovery and kind of self-directed learning, and that he's serving more as their guide and mentor as they undergo different challenges, and already they've seen opportunities for them to demonstrate their knowledge, demonstrate mastery in a way that that it works for them, that is their best mode. And there's been lots of opportunity on that first day, rather than a teacher standing up on the front and explaining how everything's going to happen. There have been a lot of opportunities on that first day for students to share their experiences, share their knowledge in a way that's fun and engaging for them. And also on that first day, there was a lot of crosstalk inside the classroom, where student voice was invited, and as students were sharing, they were encouraged to ask questions of one another. Already, there's team building and collaboration. The students went out in groups of 4, and so already they're getting to know the students at their little pod. Unbeknownst to them, that pod will change shortly. Every day, every day when they come in, they'll know where their pod is based on either a diagram on the class website or just their name on the desk. But that is the first day of Mr. Johnson's class, where they're engaging and learning in, I think, a way that is often more equitable. That sitting and listening to a teacher sometimes doesn't work as well for a lot of students, especially students that have any kind of disability, like an attentional disability, or students that maybe English isn't their first language. But just about any kid in middle school, sitting and listening to a teacher, give information via PowerPoint or reading information out of a textbook, sometimes doesn't work that well. But anyway, both those classes go really well on the first day, and actually that kind of goes forward for quite a while. This was last year, and the full first semester goes well. And as they come back in the second semester, most students are excited to come back to Mrs. Smith's classroom, and most students are excited to come back to Mr. Johnson's classroom. There is some trepidation in both classrooms. In Miss Smith's class, she has lost a few students because she does spend a lot of time in lecture. She's a great lecturer. The things she talks about are always very interesting. She always has really good examples and good demonstrations. So in terms of a lecture-based class, it's one of the better classes you can take. Mr. Johnson, by the way, doesn't end the day nearly as tired as Ms. Smith. He spends a lot of his day seated with students as they investigate their own discoveries. He doesn't spend as much time lecturing, which is enjoyable for him. Ms. Johnson's also lost a few students because she has a pretty heavy homework workload. That's just a pretty normal expectation in an advanced science class. And some students just don't have either the discipline or the organization at home or the support at home to do homework. And so she's lost a few students that way. Mr. Johnson has lost a couple students that have been successful all through their whole schooling because they're good at sitting and taking notes and memorizing things out of textbooks and paying attention. And it's not their class. Mr. Johnson's class is actually the hardest class for them because he's spent the whole first semester having to encourage them. Guys, you can like discover your own knowledge. You can Google things. You can do your own research. You can take ownership of your own learning. And that's been a semester-long process for a lot of students. When we come second semester, like I said, most students are loving both classes. And then right around February, this thing called the coronavirus creeps up. And the school system in early March realizes, based on the guidance of local health officials, they have to shut the school down. And so teachers are not given a whole lot of time to make that adjustment. This school system gives the teachers a week of just time with their PLC, their professional learning community, or with their department to try to develop virtual learning. And because starting 1 week from now, students are going to be at home. So Mrs. Smith is kind of panicked, and understandably so. She has great lectures planned for the rest of the year. She has all her worksheets ready. And one of the things she's about to lose is her classroom. And her classroom, she has put so much time and thought into creating a warm, welcoming, and safe classroom. Now her students are going to be back at home. It's going to be difficult for her to give her lectures. The schedule that they're about to get is only a couple days a week. So she's only going to get to see her students a couple days a week. And so she's going to have to cram her lectures into a shorter amount of time. And then I don't know how she's still trying to figure out how she's going to get all her worksheets out. So she's furiously at the copier, copying all the worksheets that she was going to hand out over the course of a year, trying to put them into a packet, having them bound, and then sending those worksheets home with her students. She doesn't have an online presence. The school is going to go with Zoom, and so she's going to meet with her students twice a week over Zoom. But in terms of other than Zoom and email, Miss Smith's a perfectly capable, technologically savvy person, but she's never really embedded much of that into her classroom. So she doesn't have a class website. There's not a class blog or anything, or even a YouTube channel or Twitter feed that she can utilize really to leverage that as students are all home due to COVID. Mr. Johnson's class ends up being different. They have spent the first semester building tight relationships in the classroom, personal, face-to-face relationships, but at the same time, much of what they do happens using online tools. And so they're using GitHub for a lot of their documentation and a lot of their version control and saving of data and of documents. They're using Google Docs, they're using email. There's a class Twitter feed, there's a class website, and so the students are very familiar with some of these online tools. Oh, and there's a Slack channel that they're all on. And so over the last semester, the students have been face-to-face doing real hands-on work, but much of that has also occurred in conjunction with a lot of online tools. And so Mr. Johnson isn't sweating too bad, knowing that he's not going to be able to see his students for a while, because the work that they're doing is largely, like I said, facilitated and made possible by online tools. So the pitch that Ms. Smith gives to her students as they head out the door for who knows when, for who knows how long until they come back, the pitch she has to get to her students is, I'm sorry, I'm not going to get to see you. We're not going to be together in the classroom, but I'm preparing a bunch of materials to try to keep learning going at home. Good luck. That's about the best you can do. Mr. Johnson says, guys, you know what? This is actually great. What we're about to experience is how the world works. The world doesn't work when you go to your job or just really in any time in the world. You don't have someone giving you the information. You're not waiting to be spoon-fed. That's just not how it works. When you go to your job, you're collaborating with people, and you're almost always collaborating with people over distance. Sometimes the boss might have everyone come into a room for a staff meeting. Most people will grumble and say this could have been an email, or maybe they can do it over Zoom now. But most of what we do in the real world is we have to conduct research. We have to communicate with people over email, and we have to collaborate with these great online tools that have existed for decades, like Google Docs, newer things like GitHub and Slack. And so Mr. Johnson says, this is awesome. I'm trying to teach you guys to be capable humans out in the world, and this is just the next step in that. I'm going to miss seeing you guys face to face, but we're going to make the best of this. And this, like I said, this is just a great opportunity to experience how things are done in the real world. And so then the students head off, and for the next several weeks, Mr. Johnson's class is able to continue largely as it did. Students are collaborating just as they were in teams and using these virtual tools. Eventually, Mr. Johnson realizes that some of the things that he wants the students to experience in his classroom, he has to adjust some of those things. For example, they had a nice 3D printer in the classroom, and one of the activities they were about to do is students were going to design things to be 3D printed for one of their projects. So they were going to get to watch load the files into the 3D printer themselves and watch them come out of the 3D printer. So Mr. Johnson simply says, okay, what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to send me the files. I'll make them, and then we're going to develop a system to get the 3D printed parts to you. I might have you come pick them up at the school, or I might actually drop them off at your house. And again, this is just how the real world works. often designers and engineers, they're not the ones actually fabricating the things. Often if you work as an engineer, you're utilizing online tools to send files to a machinist or some kind of fabrication lab, and then the parts show up in the mail. And so in fact, this is probably still a faster turnaround than you would get if you were a real engineer, because Mr. Johnson's gonna zip it over to your class and everyone lives relatively close to the middle school. So that is one way that we've seen two different classes that were both great, both engaging, both had really a lot of growth in their classrooms, and both those teachers, the kids learned a lot and enjoyed it. Now, the reason I bring up these two anecdotes is that as much as Miss Smith is a wonderful teacher and has been successful all through her career, she's still kind of teaching in a 1970s kind of mode before they invented this thing called the internet. And so here's kind of the next point I would like to make. The point I would like to make is this, that for a long time, for most of human history, the way we did school was one of the only ways to do school, and that was for the teacher to be the deliverer of information, to be the fount of knowledge. And so it was a great model, it was a great system to put kids on buses, send them all to a building, put them into a classroom, sit them at desks, tell them to open their notebook and take notes while the smartest person in the room gave them the information. Schools were the gatekeepers of knowledge. So if you wanted a young person to gain knowledge, there were a handful of institutions in the community, their parents, their church, and their school, that would give them that information. What schools haven't done is adopt to the fact that it's now been decades since the floodgates have burst open. All of the world's information is now out there. So I feel strongly that we are wasting our students' time and we're wasting our own breath if we stand up in front of our students and think that the best use of the time that we have together is to be lecturing at them. Direct lecture, kind of like I'm doing right now, is sometimes great. I use it occasionally in my classroom just to break up the project-based learning that we're normally doing, but it's just not the most efficient way. And like I said, it's not the most efficient delivery method. It's especially in a differentiated classroom, it's often something, the lecture I'm giving is really applicable to this project that maybe these 5 students are working on, but not yet applicable or maybe never applicable to what these students are working on. And so moving away from a lecture-based class has so many advantages. A big one is differentiation, that I can have students working on different things at different rates because I don't have to say, okay, I got to rush this lecture out because we have a quiz on this next week or tomorrow or something like that. So it enables much higher rates of differentiation. It also enables higher rates of diversity. The type of class that Ms. Smith is running kind of works for a narrow swath of students, that she is kind of bound to students coming in with a certain expertise level that she can kind of then build on. And so when she's giving her lectures and assigning readings for homework, those are all based on a certain, an expectation of a certain foundational knowledge. Mr. Johnson's class enables a much more diverse group of students. In fact, he has no prerequisites, and anyone can sign up for his class. So he's got freshmen, he's got seniors, he's got students that this is the only class they don't have an F in, and he's got students that are headed off to MIT next year. And all those students can be thriving in an environment where it's not based on what Mr. Johnson is saying at the front of the classroom. It's based on Mr. Johnson's ability to push all of those students. So Mr. Johnson's class is one where his job is more of a mentor or a coach, working with groups of students, pushing them to that zone of proximal development. So there are students that this is their first exposure to anything kind of STEM or computer or technology related. And Mr. Johnson loves those students. And sometimes he groups them together. And so he can work with all of them together and give them challenges that are more appropriate to their readiness level. And then those students that have been building robots since they were a fetus, he can work with those groups as well. Then other days he mixes those groups and he has some of those more struggling students working together on the same project, or using those higher end students or higher achieving students or more experienced students to mentor the other kids. And so Mr. Johnson isn't the only smart person in the room. And in fact, it takes time to build this kind of environment, but eventually students come to realize that they're all experts at something. And Mr. Johnson loves to be very clear about that. There's lots of reasons his job is just easier than Miss Smith's job. One is he doesn't have to be the expert in the room. And so he can easily say, we're gonna start programming Arduinos tomorrow. I've been programming Arduinos for a week. Anyone in here been programming Arduinos for longer than that? Almost definitely there'll be one student's like, oh yeah, I got one for Christmas 4 years ago. I'm kind of an expert. And that's okay. That's still that doesn't make Mr. Johnson a bad teacher. It just unseats him as the only, source of knowledge in the room. And then even the day they went out to explore to look and find where the power was coming into the building, turned out one of the students, his mom worked for the power company, and he actually had some knowledge about certain things about power line distribution, or he had a story about last time the power went out at the school. His mom actually had some details about that was interesting. And a couple days later, she zoomed into class to talk a little bit about that, which was another Mr. Johnson has this kind of environment where every student feels free to kind of add their own expertise. So now that Mr. Johnson has basically removed himself as the source of information in the class, Mr. Johnson can run a class now where students are invited to engage in the learning content and learning objectives in a way that works for them and isn't just being spoon-fed. And I think if you talk to any of his students, it's a much more authentic way to learn, and it usually sticks more. So rather than a student just trying to passively write down or just memorize information, they are engaging with it in a way that, as I said a second ago, is at a pace that works better for them. And so it's a much more equitable way to learn, that because not everyone learns really well just by listening. And one of my favorite things about this style of learning, it's a much more equitable way in terms of how students demonstrate mastery. And so if the learning objective is to memorize a bunch of things and repeat it onto a worksheet, that's just a narrow way for students to learn and a narrow way for students to demonstrate mastery. But if the learning objective is for students to engage in electronics, maybe that, and the learning objectives, by the way, the learning objectives are always very explicit in Mr. Johnson's class. This is not a mystery. He's not just saying, let's just play with circuits. He's saying, the students know, and he's clear about this, that our goal is to become experts in wiring up circuits with these 5 devices. And so we're all going to become experts in DC circuits with capacitors, resistors. We're going to become experts in using ammeters and voltmeters, and maybe even diodes and transistors and DC motors. Those are the things we're gonna become experts in. But then the way that I demonstrate my mastery of all those things can be really diverse. So a student could make a robot, could make a fan, could make a little car, probably could make a really cool video, and any of those would demonstrate our vehicles for demonstrating mastery. And so students are working together, they're creating plans, and again, Mr. Johnson is clear about the expectations for success. And so that might vary from student to student. We don't vary when we differentiate a classroom. We don't vary what the learning objectives are, but we do vary how they're going to get there. So Mr. Johnson might sit down with this group and say, okay, so you guys want to build a robot. Let's come up with a plan. Let's figure out what are going to be our measures of success. What are going to be our milestones along the way? Here's what you're going to need to do to get an A. And so when the students make their robot and it was supposed to be able to play chess and it doesn't play chess, you don't get an A. And Mr. Johnson is checking in just about every period as students are working on that, guiding them along the way, giving them advice, letting them know when they've bit off more than they can chew, or pushing kids that aren't biting off enough. And so that mode of learning is just more, like I said, it's more equitable. It works just for a larger group of students, and especially there's almost never homework in Mr. Johnson's class. And on the first day, he always gets a couple students to say, "Oh wow, so this class is going to be easy." And he has to remind them, "No, this is probably going to be your hardest class. One, you've never learned like this. You've never been completely or almost completely responsible for your own learning. That's going to be difficult for you. But also, I'm going to expect you to make I'm going to push you to make a project that is challenging for you. And it's going to be way more challenging than memorizing state capitals or anything like that. You're actually going to have to design something on your own. You're going to have to come up with a plan, figure out how to execute that plan, collaborate with your teammates, and then present your final result. And your final result probably will take several iterations in order to achieve success. So we've established our measure of success early on, and that might be really hard before we get there. So that's how Mr. Johnson's class works. Now, last thing I think I'll say is that both those classes worked pre-COVID, and COVID sort of revealed the differences. But you can't really knock Miss Smith. No one saw a global pandemic coming. So this is not an anecdote to say that Miss Smith was not prepared for a global pandemic. None of us were, including Mr. Johnson. But when it did arise, it sort of highlighted and revealed two different ways of learning that I would argue Mr. Johnson's way of learning is the 21st century way of learning. That direct lecture worked for a long time, and like I said, it was the most efficient way to deliver information. But now that we have the internet, there's just too many other ways to engage students with content, have them demonstrate mastery in a way that's more fun and more equitable. And so that, I think, is the takeaway that I have seen. Is I have seen some of my colleagues just thrive, and some of my students thrive in the virtual setting. And that the whole point, kind of the title of this talk, is that I don't think there's anything virtual about it. We're still learning. And so as we've, maybe this is the punchline, maybe I should have explained this earlier, but that's kind of the point, is that as I hear terms like blended or hybrid or virtual learning, I don't think that really applies. That in the 21st century, we all learn sometimes together in a room. Ideally, that happens frequently. I love school. I love seeing my students face to face, but I don't think going home should just, that should not be any kind of inferior or diminished form of learning. In fact, as Mr. Johnson loves to tell his students, it's just a really kind of a more real world way to do it. When you work as a real engineer, you're not going to get all the engineers in one room facing the front where your boss is telling you how to do your job. You're going to be usually sitting at, well, nowadays you might be sitting at a coffee shop or some kind of open shared office space, collaborating with people all over the world with Slack on one screen and your GitHub open on another screen, and that's just the way that it works. And I think more teachers and more schools need to adopt that mode of learning. It's a lot of fun. It prepares students with tools and some of the methods that they'll be seeing out in the real world. And maybe that's a good segue to talk a little bit about me. I didn't want to start with my biography, but just briefly, a little bit about me and my experience. I originally was an engineer. I received my master's degree in mechanical and aerospace engineering from the University of Virginia. I worked for a large defense contractor. I loved my job. I got to sit at a cubicle, worked with some great colleagues, and worked on some really great projects. Eventually decided to try teaching out. Went down the street to the local high school, got a job teaching physics, taught physics for just 4 years, and I taught traditional type of class. I lectured every day. I loved it. I tried my best to be engaging and to give, engage all of my students and to be available to all my students. We had homework, quizzes, and tests, and I think class went pretty well. And then about 7 or 8 years ago, my school had basically, on a whim, trusted me to start an engineering program. Actually, it wasn't totally a whim. At the time, I was running our school science club. Our school science club ended up being the largest club at our school. We had about 100 students in the science club. And it was through the science club was demonstrating there was a thirst for students to do cool projects in our school. And so it was kind of through their success that the school board entrusted me to start an engineering program. And I was just finishing up my PhD in curriculum and instruction. I decided I liked teaching, so I went and got a PhD in curriculum instruction. And it was just then that I just was wrapping up my doctoral work. And I kind of gave myself the challenge of writing a curriculum that looked nothing like anything I had seen before. And so I started from scratch and wrote a curriculum And the challenge I gave myself was, could I have students? So I wrote down all my learning objectives. What do I want students to get out of my class? And then I gave myself the challenge of, could I teach every one of those without lecturing, without telling my students anything? Was kind of the challenge I gave myself. So what I did is I took every one of my learning objectives and just embedded them in little challenges and projects. And I've been doing that now for 7 or 8 years. And it's absolutely transformed how I teach. First of all, I kind of alluded to this in the anecdotes earlier. I go home every day much less tired, which is nice. I spend most of my day kind of cycling through, moving around with my students, sitting down at a desk with them, maybe taking some students into a room with a whiteboard and puzzling through something with them, 3D printing something. And I just don't lecture hardly ever anymore, which is great. Occasionally what I'll do is, if students, if I think that these 5 students need to hear something, I'll pull them off to the side and give those 5 students a kind of 10-minute as needed lecture, which I think is just, students are more receptive when they're in the middle of designing an airplane. They're like, I don't know anything about lift. I'm like, come here, let's all, you 5, let's come here, let's learn about lift real quick. Or what often happens is I say, all right, you 5, how about we all go learn about lift? I don't, it's been a while since I was in grad school. I forgot most of it. So why don't I help you Google, and I can help make sense of some of the stuff you find. In fact, the other day I had some students, they were Googling something. They found a resource they thought they liked. They weren't totally sold, and they actually contacted the person that wrote the paper. It was a professor, I think it was the University of Calgary, and then got in touch with that professor. And then they have an ongoing relationship with this professor who's been helping them discover something that they need to know for their project. So I just thought that was awesome, because it was not something that I was an expert in, but because my students felt empowered to chase after their own knowledge and wisdom, they now have a relationship with a professor at the University of Calgary. So anyway, that's what I've been doing now. I've been doing now for 7 or 8 years. And I would love to hear your questions. I will say it's been a challenge for me just to change my way of teaching and what my expectations of my students are. It's definitely been more fun. I'll say that. It's just my day is more diverse than it ever was before. And the last 7 or 8 years have largely been a process of me trying to validate this as a mode of learning. So I have days where I'm like, I don't give enough homework. Is my class hard enough? I will say that one of the things I keep finding is that MIT, pretty well known for being a pretty good school, more and more as I read about and learn about, now that I have enough students at MIT, I learn about how they do learning there. That's been validating for how I do how I teach. MIT, turns out, was founded by, was it William Barton Rogers? I forget. Was founded on the idea of learning by doing. Their motto, mens et manus, means hand in mind. It was founded on the idea that we need to get away from learning just theoretically and learning by textbook, but that you can learn as an apprentice, or you can learn by getting your hands dirty. And that was before the internet. And so if MIT was founded on the idea of learning by doing, now that we have YouTube and Google, I just think that is basically the only way we should be learning these days. So I thank you for your time. I look forward to hearing your questions and talking more with you about learning by doing. And yeah, thanks.